Imagine this. You are sitting in a room full of people who are laughing. The music is right. The drinks are poured. By every external measure, this is exactly where you are supposed to want to be. And yet, somewhere beneath your ribs, there is a silence so vast it frightens you. Not because the room is empty, but because you are. You smile at the right moments. You nod. You say the things that keep the conversation moving forward. But the entire time, a part of you is watching from somewhere far above, wondering, is this really all there is? Now, here's the part that no one talks about. You leave that room and you feel something that does not have a clean name. It is not sadness exactly. It is not loneliness in the traditional sense because you are surrounded by people. It is something closer to a quiet devastation, the specific grief of a person who was present in body and entirely absent in soul. And the most disorienting part? You cannot explain it to anyone without sounding arrogant. I felt disconnected. The conversation felt shallow. I just couldn't engage. The words collapse under their own weight the moment you speak them, because from the outside, everything looked fine. This is the invisible exile, and millions of people are living inside it right now, walking through their own lives like elegant strangers, fluent in the language of surface, starving for the language of depth. Today we will explore a harsh and unsettling idea: why many highly intelligent people slowly abandon social life, not out of arrogance or bitterness, but out of lucidity. And more importantly, what Schopenhauer understood about human nature that most people never dare to face. Stay with me, because the final insight we will uncover is the most uncomfortable and powerful of all, and it can completely change how you understand solitude, intelligence, and your place in the world. This channel exists for those who seek deeper reflection. Here we explore timeless wisdom and modern psychology to understand human behavior, inner conflict, and personal growth. If these ideas resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, share this video, and write your thoughts in the comments. What we are about to reveal may transform the way you see relationships, society, and even yourself. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most brutally honest philosophers in history, believed that most human suffering is rooted in social illusion. And that is precisely where this story begins. Here is the paradox that should unsettle you. The very capacity that makes certain people extraordinary thinkers, the hunger for meaning, the refusal to accept easy answers, the almost compulsive need to understand why, is the same capacity that makes ordinary social life feel like slow suffocation. In other words, the thing that makes you most alive in your mind is the very thing that makes you feel most alien in the world. How do you reconcile that? Society is built on a kind of sacred agreement. We agree to want certain things: status, approval, comfort, belonging. We agree, above all, not to look too hard at the machinery beneath the surface, because looking too hard is disruptive. It creates friction. It makes people uncomfortable at dinner parties. And discomfort, in a world optimized for pleasantness, is the one thing that will not be forgiven. But what happens to the person who cannot stop looking? What happens to the mind that, almost against its own will, keeps pulling at the loose threads, keeps noticing the contradiction between what people say and what they mean, between the values a society claims and the ones it actually rewards, between the deep interior life a human being is capable of and the thin, glittering version of it that social life tends to permit? What happens is this: that person slowly, quietly begins to disappear. Not dramatically, not with a manifesto or a breakdown, but in small, cumulative acts of withdrawal. A declined invitation here, a conversation kept deliberately shallow there, a decision made 100 times without ever being consciously made to hold the most alive parts of yourself in reserve, because you have learned through trial and painful error that those parts tend to make people uncomfortable, confused, or worse, politely uninterested.
And so the deep thinker learns to live in two worlds simultaneously. The outer world, where they perform the expected version of themselves with quiet competence, and the inner world, vast, restless, luminous, where the real life is happening, unseen, unshared, often unnamed. The question is not whether this experience is real. The question is why it happens and whether it must continue to happen forever. Because here is what the world rarely tells you. This feeling of not belonging is not a malfunction. It is not evidence that something has gone wrong inside you. It is in fact the precise and predictable result of a collision between a particular kind of mind and a society that was never designed to accommodate it. And once you understand the true nature of that collision, everything changes. The shame dissolves, the confusion lifts, and what was once a source of private suffering begins to reveal itself as something else entirely, something that in the right light looks almost like a calling. But before we can reach that light, we have to go deeper into the dark.
There is a word in German that has no direct English translation, Weltschmerz. It means, roughly, the pain of the world, a deep, aching sorrow that arises not from personal tragedy, but from the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. Schopenhauer knew this word intimately. He lived inside it. And if you have ever felt that inexplicable heaviness, not grief over any single thing, but a kind of chronic, low-grade mourning for reality itself, then you have felt it too. This is not depression, though it can be mistaken for it. It is something more precise. It is what happens when a mind becomes capable of perceiving the full complexity of human existence, the contradictions, the fragility, the extraordinary gap between human potential and human behavior, and then is asked to go make small talk at a networking event. The collision is almost comedic, except it doesn't feel like comedy from the inside. Carl Jung was among the first modern psychologists to name what happens to the inner life of a person who thinks too deeply for the social containers available to them. He called it individuation, the slow, often painful process by which a person becomes more fully themselves, shedding the collective masks that society hands us at birth. But Jung was careful to note something crucial. Individuation is not celebrated. It is resisted by the culture, by the community, and most ferociously by the people closest to us, because when one person begins to wake up, it holds an uncomfortable mirror to everyone who has chosen to remain asleep. Nietzsche understood this resistance as something almost structural. In his framework, society does not merely fail to accommodate the deep thinker, it requires their silence. The herd, as he called it, operates by consensus. Consensus requires agreement, and agreement, at its most fundamental level, requires that no one ask the questions that would destabilize the shared story. The deep thinker, by their very nature, cannot stop asking those questions, and so they become, without ever intending to, a threat, not through any act of rebellion, but simply through the act of paying attention. Jean-Paul Sartre pushed this further into the realm of identity itself. His concept of bad faith, the human tendency to deny our own freedom by pretending we are defined by our roles and social expectations, illuminates why deep thinkers feel such violent discomfort in conventional social settings. Most social interaction is, at its core, an elaborate performance of bad faith. We play our roles. We repeat our scripts. We pretend that the version of ourselves we show the world is the whole truth. The deep thinker, who is constitutionally incapable of fully surrendering to that performance, stands at the edge of every room, feeling the artificiality like a splinter beneath the skin. Viktor Frankl, writing from the ruins of unimaginable suffering, arrived at a related but distinct insight, that human beings can endure almost any what if they have a strong enough why.
But the corollary, the part rarely quoted, is that a person who has developed a profound sense of interior meaning will find it increasingly difficult to invest in systems and relationships that offer none. Meaninglessness for such a person is not merely boring, it is physically intolerable. This is the hidden architecture of the deep thinker's isolation. It is not built from arrogance. It is not built from misanthropy. It is built brick by quiet brick from an excess of sensitivity, a nervous system and a mind so finely tuned to meaning, pattern, and truth that the noise of ordinary social life registers not as harmless background sound, but as interference, as static, as a frequency that makes it impossible to hear the one signal that actually matters. And the longer that static continues, the harder it becomes to remember what the signal even sounded like.
Here's something that neuroscience has quietly confirmed and that society has not yet figured out how to talk about. The brains of people who think deeply are, in a measurable and literal sense, working harder than average, even at rest. Research into what is called the default mode network, the system of brain regions that activates during self-reflection, imaginative thinking, and the processing of complex social information, shows that highly reflective individuals never fully switch off. While others decompress, the deep thinker is still processing, still connecting, still turning the day's events over like stones, looking for what might be hidden underneath. What looks like rest from the outside is, neurologically, a continuation of the same exhausting, relentless search for coherence. This has consequences that ripple far beyond fatigue. When the mind never fully rests, the threshold for social tolerance drops. What another person might experience as a lively, energizing conversation registers to the deep thinker as one more demand placed on a system already running at capacity. Withdrawal, then, is not a choice made from preference. It is a response made from necessity, the cognitive equivalent of a circuit breaker tripping to prevent a total system failure. And yet, from the outside, it looks like coldness, indifference, antisocial behavior. The deep thinker is penalized socially for the very act of self-preservation. But the neurological consequences are only one layer. Beneath them runs something more culturally insidious. We live in what sociologist David Reisman once called an other-directed society, a civilization in which identity is not built from the inside out, but assembled from the outside in. We calibrate ourselves constantly against the reactions of others. We curate, we perform, we optimize our personalities for engagement the way a product is optimized for market. And in this environment, the person who insists on building their identity from the inside out, from genuine values, from hard-won self-knowledge, from a relationship with truth rather than approval, becomes almost illegible to the culture around them. They're not playing the game, and in a world where everyone is playing the game, the person who refuses to is not admired, they are suspect. This creates a consequence far more damaging than loneliness. It creates self-doubt. The deep thinker, bombarded on all sides by evidence that others seem to navigate social life with ease, seem to find it fulfilling, seem to genuinely enjoy the very interactions that feel to the deep thinker like slow erosion, begins to wonder if the problem is them, if their interior life is not a sign of depth, but of dysfunction, if their inability to be satisfied by surface-level connection is not philosophical integrity, but emotional damage dressed up in intellectual language. This is the cruelest consequence of all, not the isolation itself, but the interpretation of the isolation. The story the deep thinker begins to tell themselves, I am broken. I am too much. I am not built for this world. Aldous Huxley saw this coming with frightening clarity.
In his vision of a perfectly managed society, the most dangerous thing was not violence or oppression, it was the engineering of contentment. A population that has been conditioned to find shallow things deeply satisfying will not only fail to notice the depth they are missing, it will actively pathologize the people who still remember that depth exists. The deep thinker does not just feel out of place in such a world. They feel on their worst days like evidence of a mistake. And that feeling, quiet, persistent, and almost entirely invisible to everyone around them, is the trap that no one warned them about. Because a mind that has turned its full analytical power inward against itself is no longer searching for truth, it is consuming itself. And the world, perfectly comfortable in its shallows, will not even notice it happening.
What if everything you have been told about belonging is wrong? Not slightly miscalibrated, not in need of minor adjustment, fundamentally, structurally, dangerously wrong, in a way that has been costing you not just comfort, but years of your one irreplaceable life. Here is the radical reframe. You have been operating under the assumption that the goal is to close the distance between yourself and the world around you, to find a way to fit, to sand down the parts of yourself that don't conform until the shape of you matches the shape of the space you've been given. And you have been suffering, quietly and chronically, because no matter how much you sand, the fit never quite works. There is always a remainder, always something left over that doesn't belong anywhere. But what if the distance is not the problem? What if the distance is the data? Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that the higher man does not seek happiness, he seeks power in the deepest sense, the power to create meaning, to define values, to live according to an interior law rather than an exterior one. He was not describing arrogance. He was describing the only authentic response available to a person who is seen through the illusions that keep most people comfortable and compliant. When the scaffolding falls away, you do not rebuild it. You learn to stand without it. History is full of people who made exactly this choice and changed everything as a result. Nikola Tesla spent the majority of his adult life in profound social isolation. He had no wife, no close circle, no appetite for the social rituals of his era. What he had was an inner world so rich, so generative, so relentlessly alive that the external world could not compete with it. He did not suffer his solitude. He used it as a laboratory, as a creative crucible, as the only environment in which the signal he was chasing could be heard clearly enough to follow. The world called him eccentric. History calls him a genius. The difference between those two verdicts is simply time. Simone Weil, one of the most penetrating philosophical minds of the 20th century, wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She spent her life refusing to belong to any institution, any ideology, any collective that would require her to surrender her capacity for independent thought. She was not antisocial. She was fiercely, almost sacrificially committed to truth. And she understood that truth cannot be maintained by committee. It requires solitude. It requires the courage to remain unaffiliated. This is the rebellion that no one tells you about because it is not loud, it does not march, it does not demand recognition. It is the quiet, daily radical act of refusing to pretend, of choosing depth over approval, coherence over popularity, the long interior conversation over the short external performance. And here is the counterintuitive gift hidden inside that rebellion. When you stop trying to belong everywhere, you become capable of belonging somewhere, truly, deeply, without performance, because you are no longer bringing a curated version of yourself to the table. You are bringing all of it. And the connections that survive that level of honesty are not just more meaningful than what came before. They are of an entirely different category. They are the connections that last.
The deep thinker does not need to escape their nature. They need to stop apologizing for it. Your sensitivity is not a wound. Your restlessness is not a disorder. Your refusal to be satisfied by the superficial is not arrogance. It is integrity. And integrity, lived fully and without apology, is not a barrier to connection. It is the only foundation on which real connection has ever been built. The rebellion is not against other people. It is against the false version of yourself you have been quietly maintaining to keep them comfortable. Stop maintaining it. See what remains. Because what remains, stripped of performance, stripped of apology, stripped of the exhausting labor of fitting in, is the most interesting, most alive, most genuinely human version of you that has ever existed. And that version deserves to take up space in the world.
There is a moment that many deep thinkers eventually reach. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but slowly, the way dawn arrives, imperceptibly, and then all at once. It is the moment when the question shifts, when you stop asking, "Why don't I belong?" and begin asking something far more dangerous, far more liberating, far more true. What if belonging was never the point? Sit with that for a moment, because it will try to slide past you the way the most important things always do, disguised as something simple, something you've heard before, something that doesn't require your full attention. But it does. It requires everything. Every system of meaning that human civilization has ever constructed, religion, philosophy, psychology, art, has circled the same burning question at its center. What is a human life for? And the answer that consumer society has quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly installed in the cultural operating system is this: a human life is for fitting in, for being liked, for accumulating the evidence of belonging, the followers, the invitations, the relationships that confirm again and again that you are acceptable, that you are enough, that you are not alone. And for the deep thinker, this answer has always felt like a coat that belongs to someone else. You put it on, you tried to make it work, but it never quite fit, and you could never fully explain why, and the not explaining became its own source of shame, a private, wordless conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with you. Here is the truth that will reorder everything. Nothing was ever wrong with you. What was wrong, what has always been wrong, was the question itself. Belonging, as society defines it, is a form of averaging. It requires that you occupy the middle of the bell curve, not too intense, not too quiet, not too curious, not too honest. It requires, in the most precise sense of the word, that you become less specific, less demanding, less entirely yourself. And every time you succeeded at this, every time you managed to shrink yourself into a shape the room could accommodate, you felt, beneath the relief of temporary acceptance, the specific grief of self-betrayal. Because you knew, you always knew. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote that the most common form of despair is not knowing that you are in despair. He called it the sickness unto death, a condition in which a person lives their entire life at a comfortable distance from their own soul, never fully inhabiting themselves, never fully arriving at the life that was actually theirs to live. He was not describing dramatic suffering. He was describing the quiet, well-dressed, socially successful devastation of a person who chose belonging over becoming. You were never meant to choose belonging over becoming. You were meant to become so fully, so specifically, so unapologetically yourself that the right kind of belonging would find you. Not the belonging of the averaged, the performed, the carefully managed, but the belonging of genuine recognition, the rare electric experience of being seen by another person, not despite your depth, but because of it. This is what the deep thinker's long exile in the margins was always preparing them for. Because here is what isolation, at its most alchemical, actually does. It burns away everything that is not essential, every performance, every borrowed belief,
every version of yourself that existed only to manage someone else's comfort. And what remains after that burning, what stands in the cleared ground of a self that has been stripped to its foundations, is something extraordinarily rare. A person who knows, with a precision that most people never achieve, exactly who they are, what they value, what they will and will not sacrifice, what kind of life is worth waking up for. That is not a consolation prize for failing to fit in. That is the destination. That is what the whole long, painful, bewildering journey was for. Albert Camus wrote that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, that the man condemned to push his boulder up the hill for eternity could, through radical acceptance and defiant self-ownership, find not just peace, but meaning in the very struggle that appeared to be his punishment. The deep thinker's version of this truth is equally stark and equally liberating. The very thing that made you feel most like an outsider, your refusal to stop questioning, your inability to be satisfied by surfaces, your insistence on living from the inside out, is not your burden. It is your gift. It has always been your gift. The world simply has not always known what to do with it. And perhaps it never fully will. Perhaps that is something you must make peace with, not in defeat, but in the way that a river makes peace with its banks, not by ceasing to move, but by understanding that the banks are not a prison. They are the shape that gives the moving water its power, its direction, its ability to carve canyons from stone over time. Your depth is not a problem to be solved. Your sensitivity is not a wound to be healed. Your exile from the shallows is not a failure of belonging. It is a graduate education in what it means to be fully, dangerously, irreversibly alive. So, here is the final question, not a rhetorical one, a real one, meant to follow you out of this moment and into whatever comes next. If you stopped waiting to be understood by the world and started, instead, understanding yourself with the same ferocious attention you have always given to everything else, who would you discover, and what would that person build? The quietest lives are not the emptiest. They are simply full in ways that cannot be measured by any metric the noise-filled world has yet invented. And somewhere, right now, in the silence between one thought and the next, that life is waiting for you to claim it. Not when you finally belong, now, exactly as you are.